The sky above the station turned dark before any alarm went off. It was not the kind of dark that comes with clouds or storms. It was the kind of dark that comes when something very large blocks the sun. And when Do-hyun stepped outside the eastern gate of the United Earth Diplomatic Station and looked up, he understood why the birds had stopped singing 10 minutes ago. Ships, dozens of them, massive, black, and shaped like open hands reaching downward. They floated without sound, without smoke, without any of the things humans expected from machines that large. They simply appeared, the way a mountain appears when fog clears, as if they had always been there, and the world had just decided to show them. Do-hyun stood at his post and did not move. He was not a general. He was not a diplomat or a scientist or any of the important people who are currently running through the hallways behind him, adjusting their uniforms and rehearsing their words. He was a soldier, 26 years old, from a small city near the coast where his mother still ran a small restaurant and his younger sister was finishing her last year of school. He had been assigned to Station 7 4 months ago. Guard duty. Stand here, watch there, report anything unusual. This qualified as unusual. His earpiece crackled. Do-hyun, report to Gate A. The Varric Empire is landing. He already knew. He could see the first ship descending. Slower than the others, lower, more deliberate. It was the largest one. Its surface was not metal exactly. It looked more like dark stone that had learned to move. Along its sides, symbols glowed in deep red. And even from the ground, Do-hyun could feel the air change around it. A pressure, like standing too close to something that has decided it is more important than everything nearby. He walked to Gate A without running. Representatives from 14 species had arrived at Station 7 over the past week for what the diplomats called the Grand Alignment, a summit between Earth and the major powers of the known galaxy. Humans had been part of galactic society for only 11 years. 11 years was nothing. Most species had histories that ran into the thousands, some into the tens of thousands. Humanity was the newest arrival at a table that had been set long before they were born. And now the Varric Empire had come. The Varric were not the largest empire. They were not the oldest, but they were by most measures the most feared. Not because they destroyed planets, they rarely did. They were feared because of how they moved through space, quietly, completely. When the Varric decided something belonged to them, it simply became theirs, and nobody could clearly explain how it had happened. Their queen had ruled for over 300 years. Her name was Mara-eth, and the galaxy treated that name the way storms treat open land, with complete and total respect. Do-hyun reached his position at Gate A and stood at attention. Around him, the other guards were shifting, small movements, adjusted stances, eyes that kept drifting upward toward the descending ship. He understood it. He felt it too. That pull in the chest, that awareness that something massive and old and deeply uninterested in your comfort was about to be very close to you. He felt it. He simply did not move because of it. The ramp lowered. It was long, wider than a road, made of the same dark stone-like material as the ship, and it descended without a sound, touching the courtyard floor as gently as a hand placed on a sleeping child's shoulder. And then the figures began to appear. Varric soldiers were tall, nearly 3 meters, with 4 arms, and a way of standing that suggested they had never once in their lives felt uncertain about anything. They wore black armor that seemed to absorb light, and their eyes were the color of deep water. They moved in perfect formation, and as they reached the bottom of the ramp and spread out across the courtyard, the air in the space changed again, heavier, older. Then came the attendants, then the advisors. each of them radiating the particular energy of people who were used to being the most important thing in any room they entered. And then came Queen Maraeth. She was not the tallest figure on the ramp. She was not the most armored. But the moment she appeared, everything else became background. She wore deep red robes that moved slowly even without wind, and her face, angular, pale as bone, eyes like two pieces of dark glass, held an expression that was not quite a look. It was more like a verdict. She descended the ramp at a pace that said she had never rushed for anything. The effect on the courtyard was immediate. Every diplomat went to one knee. The Garelian representatives, who had fought 3 wars in the last century and were known across the galaxy for their pride, dropped without hesitation. The Thelian observers, tall and blue and formally neutral in all things, lowered themselves with practiced grace. The 2 Marathi delegates touched their foreheads to the ground. Even the human diplomats, following the cultural briefings they had received, bent their knees. The courtyard filled with the sight of every species, every delegation, every important person kneeling. Do-hyun did not kneel. He stood, back straight, eyes forward, rifle at rest position, exactly as protocol required. Korean military protocol, specifically, which called for a soldier on active guard duty to remain at attention during any official arrival, regardless of the visiting dignitary. It was not a decision he made in that moment. It was simply what the protocol said, and Do-hyun followed protocol because that was what a soldier did. He was not making a statement. He was not being brave. He was doing his job. But in a courtyard full of bent knees, one person standing is the only thing anyone can see. Queen Maraeth reached the bottom of the ramp. Her eyes moved across the courtyard, slowly the way eyes move when they are not searching, but simply recording. And they passed over the kneeling figures the way a light passes over furniture. Expected, unremarkable. Then her gaze reached Do-hyun. It stayed there. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in a silence that full and a moment that heavy, 3 seconds was enough for everyone in the courtyard to notice exactly where the queen's eyes had stopped. Do-hyun looked straight ahead and did not blink. Maraeth's expression did not change. She moved forward toward the station entrance, and her attendants flowed around her like water around stone. The ramp retracted. The moment passed. People began to rise from their knees. No one said anything to Do-hyun. But he noticed the looks from the other guards, from the diplomats, from the Garelian representatives who were brushing dust from their knees and glancing at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. He returned to his post. Above the station, the fleet of dark ships held their positions in the sky, silent and vast, watching everything below with the patient certainty of things that had never needed to hurry. And from a high window in the descending Queen's own vessel, still retracting its landing systems, still settling into dock, a pair of eyes watched the courtyard below. They had not stopped watching since the ramp first touched the ground. They were watching the soldier who had not kneeled. Princess Leal had read every file on humans that the Varick Intelligence Archive held. That was not a small thing. The Varick had been watching Earth since before humans had electricity. They had files going back centuries, observations from long-range sensors, intercepted communications, behavioral analyses, ecological records. They had watched humans build fires, and then cities, and then rockets, and then faster-than-light drives in what the Varick considered an almost alarming amount of time. Most species took millennia to reach space. Humans had done it in a handful of centuries, and arrived at the galactic table still arguing with each other about minor geographical boundaries. The Varick intelligence teams had flagged humanity as a species of interest. Interesting, but manageable. New, but not threatening. Worth watching, but not worth worrying about. Leal had read every word of every file, and still, Nothing in those files had prepared her for what she saw from the window. She was 20 years old in human terms, though Varric aging worked differently, and she had lived what would feel like much longer in memory and experience. She had traveled to 6 other star systems. She had stood in rooms where the fate of entire planets was decided. She had been trained from the time she could walk, to observe, to analyze, to never let emotion sit in the front of her expression. She watched the soldiers stand. Not stand in the way someone stands when they are trying to make a point. Not stand with clenched jaw or raised chin or any of the physical signals that meant defiance. Just stand. Correctly, precisely. The way a soldier stands when standing is the job. Every other being in that courtyard had knelt. Her mother walked past a field of bent backs and lowered heads, as was right and expected. Even the Gorelians, who had made it a point of cultural identity to never bow to anyone, went down. They always did eventually. Everyone did. Not this one. Liel pulled up his record within minutes. It was not difficult. The station had submitted a full personnel file on every human present at the summit, as required by Varric diplomatic protocol. She found him quickly. Do-hyun, age 26, rank Sergeant, assigned to Station 7 4 months ago. Home region, South Korea, East Asia, Earth. Previous postings, 2 years at a base in the northern continent, 1 year at an orbital platform. Commendations, 3. Disciplinary record, clean. No remarkable incidents. No political affiliations beyond the standard. His emergency contact was listed as his mother. His mother ran a restaurant. Liel read the file twice. There was nothing in it that explained what she had just seen. Nothing that said this man is different, or this man will stand while others kneel. The file was ordinary in every direction, which somehow made what he had done more interesting, not less. She set the file down and watched the courtyard empty. Her attendant, a tall and careful woman named Veth, appeared at the doorway. "Princess, your mother requests your presence at the opening reception within the hour." "I know," Liel said, without turning from the window. "Shall I prepare your—" "I want to speak with one of the human guards." Veth paused. "I'm sorry?" "The one who stood during my mother's arrival. Sergeant Do-hyun. I want to speak with him." Liel finally turned from the window. Her expression was even, calm, the way it always was, but her eyes carried something that Veth recognized, the particular quality of attention that appeared when the princess had decided something was worth understanding. Veth chose her next words carefully. "Princess, the summit schedule is—" "I'm not asking about the schedule. I'm asking for a meeting to be arranged." Liel moved toward the inner chamber to prepare for the reception. Quietly. No announcements, just an introduction. "Your mother's advisors will—" "My mother's advisors laugh at things they don't understand," Liel said simply. "That has always been their habit. It has also always been their limitation." Veth said nothing after that. She bowed slightly and went to make the arrangements. The opening reception was everything these events always were. Long tables, formal seating, speeches in 6 languages, food designed to meet the dietary needs of 14 species without offending the cultural preferences of any of them. Liel sat at the elevated table beside her mother and performed the role of princess with the ease of someone who had been doing it their whole life. She smiled at the right moments. She spoke when spoken to. She expressed gracious interest in the remarks of the Thelian delegation leader, and asked thoughtful questions of the Marathi ambassador about the trade agreements currently being drafted. And from across the enormous room, at a secondary post near the eastern door, she watched Sergeant Do-hyun stand at attention for 3 hours without once appearing bored. Most people, even trained guards from advanced species, showed something during long ceremonial duties. A small shift in weight, a slight softening of the eyes, the body's quiet campaign to remind the mind that it was tired. Do-hyun showed nothing. Not stiffness, which would have meant effort. Just steadiness. which meant the opposite, that this was simply his natural state. Liel found this deeply unusual. She had grown up around Varric soldiers, and even the finest of them had tells. The complete absence of them was either the result of extreme training or something more fundamental about how a person was built inside. She filed the observation carefully and turned back to the ambassador from Marathi, who was explaining something about tariff structures that she was now going to have to ask him to repeat. The arranged meeting came the following morning. Veth had managed it with her usual efficiency, framed as a cultural exchange, logged as a low-priority event, assigned a small conference room on a quiet floor of the station. No announcement, no press. 2 of Liel's personal guard stationed outside, and 2 of the station's guards as well. Yuna, a human linguist who had been working at the station for 2 years, was brought in to help with translation, though Liel's command of the human common language was already fairly strong. Do-hyun arrived exactly on time. He walked in, looked at Liel directly, not with the careful sidelong glances most humans used when meeting Varric, and stood at what she had come to recognize as his default position, straight, settled, present. "Sergeant," Yuna said quietly in Korean, "the princess has asked to speak with you as part of a cultural exchange. Please be respectful and honest. You may speak freely." Do-hyun nodded once. Then he looked at Liel and said, in careful, accented common language, "It's an honor, princess." Liel studied him for a moment. "Yesterday," she said, "during my mother's arrival, you did not kneel. It was not a question, but she left space for a response. Guard protocol on active post doesn't permit it." "Protocol," she repeated. "Yes. Not defiance. No." Liel tilted her head slightly. Most beings, when faced with something they did not intend to cause, apologize for it. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment, then, "I didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing to apologize for." Across the table, Yuna's pen stopped moving on her notepad. Liel looked at the soldier in front of her, young, ordinary by file, from a planet that had been in space for barely a decade, and felt something she rarely felt during formal meetings, genuine curiosity. "Sit down, Sergeant," she said. He sat, correctly, without the nervous energy that usually filled the space around people sitting across from her. Outside, the Varric fleet waited in the sky. Inside the station, 14 species were negotiating the shape of the next 100 years. And, in a quiet conference room on an unremarkable floor, a princess who had read every file on humanity realized that the files had missed something important. She was going to have to figure out what it was. The meetings continued for 4 days. Liel did not announce them. She did not add them to the official summit calendar or mention them to her mother's senior advisors. She simply had Veth arrange the room each morning, and each morning Do-hyun arrived on time, and Yuna sat at the corner of the table with her notebook and her quiet professionalism, and the 3 of them talked. It had been a long time since Liel had simply talked to anyone. That was not a complaint. It was an observation. Her life was full of conversations, long ones, important ones, conversations where every word was weighted and every silence was strategic. She had conversations with ambassadors, with military commanders, with her mother's council members, who measured each sentence before they released it into the room. She had been trained for them since she was old enough to sit at a formal table. But those were not the same as talking. On the first morning, she asked Do-hyun about protocol, why humans organized their military behavior the way they did, what the logic was behind standing versus kneeling, saluting versus bowing, the particular hierarchy of gestures that different Earth cultures use to signal respect. He answered plainly, no performance, no attempt to impress her. He explained the history, how military customs on Earth differed by region, why the Korean military tradition had developed the specific protocols it had, what the original purpose of standing at attention was. He made it clear when something was his opinion, and when it was established fact. When he didn't know something, he said so without embarrassment. Yuna translated the parts where his common language ran out. On the second morning, Liao shifted the conversation. She asked him what he thought about the summit. Not what he was allowed to say. She was clear about that distinction. What he actually thought. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he thought most of the important decisions had probably already been made before anyone arrived, and that the summit was partly about making those decisions feel like they had been reached together, which was not dishonest exactly, just diplomatic. Yuna's pen paused again. She had a habit of pausing when he said something she didn't expect. Liao asked him if he thought that was a problem. He said he thought it was just how large groups of beings managed to agree on anything without it taking forever. You decided privately, you confirmed publicly. It worked. He wasn't complaining about it, he was just describing it. You describe things very directly, Liao said. Is that a problem? It's unusual. I've been told that before, he said. Not with pride. Just acknowledgement. On the third morning, she asked about his family. Not as a formal inquiry, she had already read the file, already knew the basic facts. She asked because she wanted to hear him talk about them. She had noticed that the flatness in his voice, that steady, even quality that never changed in professional conversation, changed slightly when something genuinely mattered to him. She had caught it once briefly, when he mentioned something about his home city. She wanted to see if it happened again. It did. He told her about his mother's restaurant, small place, near the water, about 30 tables. His mother had run it alone since his father died when Do-hyun was 12. The food was simple, the kind of food people ate when they were hungry and tired and needed something that felt like home. His mother had never once talked about closing the place, even in the years when it barely broke even. He said it without sentiment, but there was something behind the words, a kind of deep, uncomplicated respect that Liao recognized from almost no one. She asked about his sister. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It was not a large smile, just a slight softening at the corners, a change in the eyes. But it was real in a way that most expressions she encountered were not. She wants to be an engineer, he said. She'll be better at it than she thinks she will. She always is. Yuna was not writing anything down by this point. She was just listening. Liao thought about her own family, about the distance between herself and her mother that had grown over the years, not from conflict, but from the nature of what they both were. Queens did not have daughters. Not really. She had been loved. She was certain of that. But she had been loved the way a very important building is loved, with maintenance and care and protection, not with the uncomplicated warmth that lived in Do-hyun's voice when he talked about his sister. She did not say any of this. On the fourth morning, she told him things. She had not planned to. She had meant it to be another day of questions, more information, more filing away of observations. But somewhere in the middle of a conversation about how humans managed fear, a topic she had brought up clinically as research, she found herself describing what it had been like to arrive at her first galactic summit at the age of 12. How every room had been full of beings who were looking at her not as a person, but as a symbol of something. How she had learned very early that the safest thing was to give people exactly what they expected. Do-hyun listened without speaking. When she finished, he said, "That sounds exhausting." Not, "How interesting." Not, "What a great responsibility." Not any of the careful, formal responses she was used to receiving when she shared anything about herself. Just, "That sounds exhausting." Yuna glanced up from her notebook. Lyle looked at this human soldier with his ordinary file and his direct words, and his smile that only appeared when he talked about his sister. And she felt something that she had no clean word for in either language. Something that had to do with the experience of being seen by a person who had no reason to perform anything for you. "It is," she said. Her voice was even. "It is exhausting." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they understand something and aren't going to make a big thing of it. They sat in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence, the other kind. The kind that exists between people who have said something real and don't feel the need to immediately cover it with more words. Then Do-hyun said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why me? You could have arranged this meeting with any of the human delegation, diplomats, scientists, any of the officials." He looked at her steadily. "Why a guard?" Liel considered the question. Then she answered honestly. "Because the diplomats and scientists were kneeling," she said. "I already know what people look like when they're doing what they think is expected of them. I wanted to know what someone looked like when they were just doing what they actually do." Do-hyun thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded again. Yuna quietly turned a new page in her notebook. Outside the window of the small conference room, the station hummed with the activity of 14 species, negotiating the shape of the galaxy. In the hallways, advisors carried documents, diplomats rehearsed remarks, guards rotated their posts. And in this room, something quiet was happening that no file would ever fully describe. A princess, who had been raised to be a symbol, was discovering what it felt like to simply be a person, and finding that the discovery had been sitting right across a plain table from her this whole time. She did not have a word for what that was yet, but she remembered every detail of it, every single one. It happened on the 6th day of the summit, at 20 minutes past noon, during a scheduled recess between the 3rd and 4th formal sessions. Most of the important figures were in the station's main hall, the large central space that connected the meeting rooms, dining area, and guest corridors. Queen Maraeth was moving through the hall with her senior advisors and 2 of her personal guard, headed toward a private session with the Thelian delegation. It was a routine movement. It had been logged, timed, and coordinated with station security 3 hours in advance, as all Queen's movements were. That was the problem with logging things in advance. Do-hyun was at his post near the hall's eastern corridor. It was not a prestigious position. Main posts closer to the meeting rooms were held by senior guards, and the eastern corridor was mostly a through route, a passage people used when moving between the hall and the outer wings of the station. He was there because his rotation said he was there. He was not thinking about anything in particular when the light above the service access panel on the west wall flickered. Most people would not have noticed it. The station's lighting system flickered occasionally. Minor power fluctuations, nothing serious. The kind of thing maintenance logged and dealt with on a weekly basis. But Do-hyun had been standing in that corridor long enough to know that the panel on the west wall did not flicker. He had been watching it for 4 days. It was part of a section of the station that ran on a separate power circuit, insulated from the fluctuations that affected the main lights. He was already moving before he had fully formed the thought. He crossed the hall at a controlled run, not a sprint, which would have caused panic, but fast enough that the station guard at the opposite post turned to look at him with alarm. Do-hyun reached the service panel in 8 seconds and pulled the cover open in one motion. Inside, a device, small, flat, the kind of thing that required someone with detailed knowledge of the station's infrastructure to place correctly, which meant the threat had been inside the station for some time, possibly days, possibly from the beginning. He turned back to the hall. Queen Maraeth was 15 meters away and moving closer. Do-hyun did not have time to evaluate all variables. He did not have time to call it in fully, wait for confirmation, defer to someone with a higher rank who was better positioned to make the call. He had time to do one thing, and he chose it without hesitation. "Down," he shouted, in common language, then in Varric, using the 3 words of Varric he had picked up during the summit. "Get down, now!" The hall erupted. The Varric personal guard reacted exactly as trained. They surrounded the Queen in a physical formation, which was correct, but which also meant they were stationary, which was not what the situation needed. The diplomatic aides scrambled in several directions. 3 of the human station guards were reaching for communication devices. The Gorelian delegates were already reaching for weapons they weren't supposed to have inside the station. Maraeth did not flinch. She stood in the center of her guard formation and looked across the hall with the expression of someone who was rapidly assessing the situation and did not intend to be surprised by any conclusion. Do-hyun was already running back toward the device. Later, the analysts would spend considerable time discussing what he did next, and why it was, technically, not the recommended protocol for improvised device management. The recommended protocol involved evacuation, containment, and specialist response. Do-hyun knew the recommended protocol. He also knew that the device showed an active sequence on its display panel, a countdown that was now under 40 seconds, and that specialist response would take considerably longer than that. He used his jacket. It was not elegant. It was the material he had immediate access to, and the device was a type that worked through directed energy rather than explosion, which meant physical shielding was at least partially effective, which meant the jacket wrapped tightly around it and pressed flat against the wall would not stop it, but would redirect and weaken the discharge. It was enough. When the device activated, at 31 seconds on the countdown, the discharge went into the wall and the floor and Do-hyun's left side, which took the remaining energy. He was thrown 2 meters and landed hard against the opposite wall. He stayed conscious long enough to confirm that the device had discharged fully, which meant there would be no second activation. Then the pain arrived, and consciousness left. The hall was silent for approximately 4 seconds after the discharge. 4 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In a room full of beings from 14 species, it is a very long time. In those 4 seconds, no one spoke, no one moved, no one gave any orders. The smoke cleared slightly. The emergency lighting activated with a low, red glow. Do-hyun was on the floor against the wall, not moving. Queen Maraeth stepped out of her guard formation. Her senior advisor made a movement as if to stop her, and she looked at him in a way that stopped him instead. She walked across the hall, past the scattered diplomatic aides, past the frozen station guards, past the Gorelian delegates who had their unauthorized weapons drawn and had no idea what to aim them at, and she stopped beside Do-hyun. She looked down at him for a long moment. His breathing was visible, shallow but present. The burn on his left side was serious, but not what the medical team would later classify as immediately life-threatening. He was alive. Maraeth turned to her personal guard and said in Varric 4 words. The guard commander straightened immediately and began issuing orders. Within 90 seconds, the station's full medical team was moving. The hall was being cleared, and Varric communication specialists were beginning the process of tracing how a device had been placed inside a secured diplomatic facility. Lial arrived at the hall at a run, with Veth 3 steps behind her. She had been in her room when the alert came through. She had heard the discharge, a low, heavy thud that had vibrated through the station's walls. She had known immediately. She could not have explained how, but she had known. She stopped when she saw her mother, standing in the center of the hall. Unharmed, composed, already managing the situation with the calm efficiency that had defined her rule for 3 centuries. Then she saw Do-hyun on the floor. She crossed the hall without thinking about what it looked like. She was a princess, and she was aware that people were watching, and she did not care at all. She reached him as the medical team was arriving, and she crouched beside him and looked at his face, pale now, still, the steadiness of his expression unchanged, even in unconsciousness, as if even here his body didn't know how to show distress. And she felt something move through her chest that was enormous and hot and very difficult to name. "He needs immediate treatment," she said to the medical team, in a voice that did not invite discussion. The lead medic, a human woman who had been stationed at the summit for exactly this kind of emergency, looked at Leal, then at Do-hyun, then back at Leal. "Yes, Princess, we're on it." Yuna appeared at the edge of the hall, pale-faced, notebook still in her hand. She looked at Do-hyun, and her expression cracked in a way that notebooks and professionalism couldn't cover. Leal looked back. Neither of them said anything. On the other side of the hall, the Garelian delegation's senior representative finally lowered his weapon. He looked at the spot on the floor where Do-hyun had been. He looked at the medical team lifting the human soldier carefully onto a transport board. He turned to his second and spoke quietly in Garelian. His second translated for the nearest station guard. He said, "The human moved before any of us." The station guard didn't respond, because there wasn't anything to respond to. It was simply true. All across the hall, beings from 14 species who had spent 6 days very carefully positioning themselves relative to each other, measuring power, measuring standing, measuring whose words carried the most weight, were very quiet. Nobody was measuring anything right now. They were all watching a 26-year-old soldier from a small planet at the edge of the galaxy being carried carefully out of the hall by people who were trying very hard not to let their hands shake. And above the station, the Varek fleet held its position in the sky, as it had for 6 days, vast and quiet and patient. But something had shifted. Even ships that far up could feel it. Do-hyun woke up to white. Not a light, just the color. The pale, flat ceiling of the station's medical wing, slightly too bright, the kind of white that medical rooms always seem to use, as if brightness was a form of reassurance. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory. Left side, painful, a deep burning kind that had settled into something steady rather than sharp. Head, clear. Hands, both present, both responding. Breathing, fine. He turned his head. Yona was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She had her notebook in her lap, but she wasn't writing in it. She was asleep, chin dropped slightly, one hand still loosely holding her pen. She looked like someone who had intended to stay awake, and lost the argument with exhaustion. Do-hyun looked at the ceiling again. He thought about the hall, the panel, the countdown he had seen on the device's display. The math of the situation had been simple. Not easy, but simple. There was enough time to do one thing. He had done it. That was the whole of what happened from his perspective. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone with a very painful left side who needed water. He was reaching for the cup on the side table when the door opened. He expected a medic. He got Liao. She was not in formal dress. She wore a plain outer robe, dark blue, simple, with no insignia, no adornments. Her hair, which he had only ever seen carefully arranged, was pulled back plainly. She looked for the first time since he had met her, like a person rather than a position. She stopped just inside the door when she saw that he was awake. He looked at her. "Princess, you're awake," she said. "Apparently," he paused. "How long?" 14 hours. She moved to the chair on the opposite side of the bed, from where Yuna was sleeping. She looked at him with an expression that he had never seen on her face before. Something unguarded, something that had not been arranged. "You're going to be fine," she said. The medics were clear about that. The discharge affected tissue, not anything deeper. "You'll have full use of your left side within 2 weeks." "Good," he said. She looked at him. That's all you're going to say? What else should I say? She was quiet for a moment. Most people, when they have done something like what you did, have a great deal to say about it. I did my job, he said, not flatly, just as a fact, the same way he said most things. Liel looked at her hands for a moment. She had very still hands. Do-hyun had noticed that in their meetings, that she rarely moved them in the anxious, unconscious ways that most people did. But right now, they were not entirely still. My mother wants to meet you formally, she said, when you're well enough. She will want to express official gratitude. There will be a ceremony of some kind. Her advisors are drafting the language. I understand. That will be very different from this, she said quietly. That will be the official version. He looked at her. And this is the actual version. She met his eyes. Yes. Yuna shifted in her chair, resettled, did not wake up. Liel said, when I saw you on the floor, She stopped. She started again. I have been trained to manage my responses in high-pressure situations. I have spent 20 years learning exactly that. And when I came into that hall and saw you on the floor, I managed none of it. None. Do-hyun didn't say anything. He waited. I don't know what that means, she said. I don't have a word for it. I think you do, he said. She looked at him. You're just deciding whether to use it, he said. She looked at Do-hyun, then at Liel, then at the space between them, with the particular awareness of someone who had walked into the middle of something and was carefully deciding how much to notice. You're awake, she said to Do-hyun, voice still rough from sleep. Apparently, he said again. She poured him water without being asked, which was why she was good at her job. 3 days later, Do-hyun was cleared to leave the medical wing on limited duty. The summit had continued without pause. These things could not stop for one person, even if one person had changed the texture of the whole event. The diplomatic work went on. The language of agreements was hammered out in careful sessions. Species who had been rivals for generations signed documents that committed them, in measured and formal terms, to at least attempting cooperation. But the hall had different air in it now. People had seen something there, and they had not forgotten. On the morning of the final day of the summit, Do-hyun was cleared to attend the closing ceremony. He was not a delegate. He was not anyone, officially, in the context of what was happening. He stood with the other station guards along the back wall of the Great Hall, in his uniform, left side still bandaged beneath it, and he watched 14 species arrange themselves for the formal close. Queen Maraeth entered last, as she always did. The hall rose, all beings in it, from all species, rising in the specific show of collective respect that had been agreed on as the closing ceremony's opening gesture. Do-hyun rose with them. The ceremony proceeded. Speeches were made. Documents were signed. The Thelian delegation made a formal address in 4 languages. The Garelian senior representative, in a move that surprised everyone, including his own delegation, made a brief and genuine statement of appreciation for what he called the spirit of the summit, which everyone in the room understood to be about more than diplomacy. Then, near the end, when the formal agenda had been completed and the room had shifted into the looser, transitional energy of an event that was almost over, Liel walked across the hall. She walked with purpose, without hurry, without performance. She crossed the open floor of the great hall in the plain, deliberate way of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had made their peace with it. She walked to the back wall, where the station guards were standing. She walked to Do-hyun. The hall went quiet. Not all at once. It was a gradual quiet, the sound leaving the room the way air leaves a space when something very still moves into it. Conversation stopped. Movement stopped. The 14 delegations, the advisors, the guards, the diplomats, the observers from species Do-hyun couldn't name, they all stilled. Liel stood in front of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The hall held its silence like something precious that might break. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. It was not a formal gesture. There was no Varek ceremony that looked like this, no diplomatic protocol that called for it, no precedent in the 3 centuries of Marath's reign, or in any summit record that any of the advisors could later locate. It was simply what it was, a person holding on to another person in a room full of watching eyes, without any concern at all for what those eyes made of it. Do-hyun's arms came up slowly, and he held on back. The hall did not move. Not one being spoke. Not the Goralian representatives who had been carrying unauthorized weapons 6 days ago. Not the Thelian observers, who prided themselves on having a formal response to every situation. Not the advisors, who had spent weeks preparing statements for every possible outcome of this summit. Not the human delegates, who were going to have a very interesting report to file. Not Yuna, who was standing 3 people down the wall from Do-hyun, with her notebook at her side and her expression completely open. Not Queen Mara-eth. She stood at the center of the hall, robes still and face composed, and she watched her daughter. And those who were positioned close enough to see her face, and there were not many, saw something there that they had not seen in all the formal portraits and official recordings and historical documentation of her reign. Something soft. Something that had nothing to do with power or strategy or the management of empires. Something older than all of that. After a long moment, Lyle stepped back. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right now. The words, the real ones, the ones that mattered, would come later. In quieter rooms, in the unhurried time that neither of them had the luxury of yet, but that both of them could feel, somewhere just ahead, like a door that had been left open. She turned and walked back across the hall. The silence held for 3 more seconds after she reached her place. Then sound returned. Slowly, unevenly, the way it always does after something real has happened. Conversations resumed. People moved. The ceremony concluded, and the summit drew to its close. Afterward, in the reports and analyses and diplomatic summaries that circulated across the galaxy over the following weeks and months, the closing ceremony of the Grand Alignment was noted for the documents signed, the agreements reached, and the new shape of cooperation between 14 species. But the moment that people actually talked about, in corridors and private messages, in the quiet conversations that happened after the formal ones, was not in any official record. It was just a princess crossing a room, and a soldier who had never once, in 6 days, tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. And a hall full of beings from the far ends of the galaxy who had for one moment forgotten every difference between them, and simply watched 2 people be human. One of them actually was. That, most agreed, was beside the point.